Welcome to the Self-Discovery Files, a place for reflection, challenge, and becoming who you're meant to be. I'm your host, Dylan Phipps. You can find me on TikTok and Instagram at @TheDylanPhipps for more daily insights. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Self-Discovery Files. This is episode 10, and today we're going to be talking about something that kind of builds on last episode. If you remember, episode 9 was the burden of potential. And now we're going to be talking about the weight of freedom. Okay, that's the title of this episode. Okay, and so last episode talked about, the responsibility that you have that you can't unsee. And so this episode's more about what happens after you accept that responsibility, right? So let's start with the moment that freedom stops feeling light. Right, because a lot of people, when they get freedom, it's almost like a breath of fresh air. All of the things that have been kind of weighing them down get lifted off them and they feel light, right? And so this is when freedom stops feeling light. There's a specific moment that this happens, and the first time that I realized that freedom was heavier than I expected was after graduating high school. Okay, I went from a life where everything was structured, right? I had classes, practices, all my schedules and expectations were structured. And then I went to a life where almost none of that existed anymore. Okay, my first year of college, I had 2 online classes and 1 in person, right? I didn't take a heavy load, and so that left me with a lot of open time, right? And at first, that sounds like a good thing. People would be like, oh, I would kill to have that, I would kill to have that much free time and that much downtime to be able to do what I want. Right? There's no one telling you where to be or checking if you showed up to your classes or enforcing a schedule on you. There's no one really watching you at all. But very quickly I noticed that it felt strange. Something felt strange. The freedom that I had didn't feel relaxing. It felt heavy. And so that was the complete opposite of what I had always associated freedom with, right? It felt heavy. Not because I had too much to do or a lot of responsibilities, but because I had to decide what mattered. And so there was this quiet pressure that showed up, right? It was an internal pressure. It was a feeling like in your head, you're talking to yourself and you're telling yourself, I should be doing something. I should be moving somewhere. I should be, becoming something. I should be making progress in some facet. And that pressure didn't come from school or a deadline or something that was required. It came from me. And so that's when I realized something that most people don't really expect. And that is that freedom doesn't remove responsibility, it relocates it. Right? People think that freedom will make them less stressed and less anxious and less weighed down. But what freedom actually gives you is space. Okay? It gives you the space to think. It gives you the space to choose, the space to decide direction, and that space can be uncomfortable if you don't know how to use it. Because when you're busy all the time, life will tell you what to focus on, right? But when you're free, you have the freedom to decide, and you have to make that choice for yourself, and that's the part that nobody prepares you for. Freedom forces you to confront questions you can ignore when life is structured, right? What am I actually working towards? What matters enough to give my time to? What am I building towards? Right? What happens if I waste this? What happens if I waste time, right? Because everything is structured for you and that's already decided. But those questions don't come with instructions, right? Another thing that I noticed was how easy it was to blame circumstances before freedom. And how hard that became afterward, right? When structure exists, it's easy to sit there and say, I couldn't do this because of school. I couldn't do this because of my schedule. I just didn't have time. I couldn't, you make excuses because of that structure. But when you suddenly have time, those explanations don't work anymore. And at some point, I had to admit something super uncomfortable. Right? I wasn't blocked, right? I wasn't unable to do things. I just wasn't prioritizing. And so that shift is where freedom starts to feel heavy, because once you realize that obstacles are movable, responsibility becomes super unavoidable for yourself. And emotionally unstructured freedom doesn't feel like peace. It usually feels like anxiety, right? Because there's no direction for you, so you feel anxious. Um, it can feel like boredom because there's nothing there to demand your attention and for your mind to kind of focus on and latch onto. It can feel like stress, right? Because the day is wide opened and your priorities are undefined, but there's still that expectation to prioritize um, building something, right? And so humans by mass don't do well with complete openness, right? We need constraints and we need routines and we really need something to organize our attention. Because without structure, your brain is constantly trying to hold everything at once, right? What you should do, what you could do, what you're avoiding, what you're behind on. And that's so exhausting. Okay, so the truth about freedom is this. Okay, freedom isn't light. It's very weighty. Because for the first time, no one's giving you structure. No one's giving you direction. No one's deciding what matters. You have to do that. And that means sorting through uncertainty and indecision and possibility all on your own. And that's why one of the most uncertain times of your life is after you graduate high school and you step into college. That's the first time where you get a bunch of freedom that you're really not used to, and your life direction kind of sits in your hand. There's a big developmental curve that happens within the 4 years of college, and even within the months leading up to going into college. That's also why freedom feels overwhelming to so many people. Not because it's bad, because it demands maturity. And so if you don't learn how to carry that weight that it brings, freedom won't liberate you. It'll destabilize you. Okay? And so that leads me into my next section that I want to talk about, because once that structure disappears, there's something that is super predictable that happens internally, and most people don't really understand why it happens, right? So when your external structure disappears, right, the things that are holding your routines and your daily actions in place, most people assume that they'll naturally rise to the occasion, right? They imagine freedom unlocking their motivation and their creativity and all the discipline in the world. What usually happens is actually the opposite, okay? When I first had that freedom, I didn't suddenly become more focused, even though beforehand, when my life was structured, I was a super disciplined, super work heavy, work focused person, right? I didn't become more of that. I actually defaulted to what felt familiar, right? I did the things that were comfortable, right? I did the things that I already knew that I was good at, or that gave me immediate feedback and relief and dopamine, right? And it's not because I was lazy, but because comfort requires no orientation. And so that freedom that you get, it introduces uncertainty. And so your brain automatically looks for stability when uncertainty shows up. So it reaches backwards instead of forwards. It leans on the things that you know are comfortable, that you know you're good at, that you know you enjoy. Right? And so that's the first psychological shift that people don't expect. Without structure, your mind regresses before it advances. Structure normally does something very important, right? It forces contact with tasks that you would rather avoid, right? All the studying, planning, doing the boring stuff, sitting with discomfort. And so when structure ends, you don't negotiate with those tasks. They're simply what's next. When structure disappears, everything becomes optional, and optional tasks don't get done, especially the super difficult ones. And so this is where people misinterpret what's happening. They think that they've lost motivation. But motivation wasn't lost. It was never designed to function without constraint. Because motivation thrives on necessity. When nothing is required, motivation has nothing to push against. Okay, and that's why unstructured freedom doesn't feel energizing, it feels draining. Your brain is constantly deciding instead of executing. What should I do? right? What matters most? What is the best use of this time? What if I choose wrong? Those questions in your brain, they sound thoughtful, but they're cognitively expensive. And structure answers those questions in advance. But freedom asks you to answer them every day. And so that's super exhausting. And over time, something else happens. When there's no external demand, your purpose starts to thin out quietly. You stop feeling pulled forward and the pressure to show up or needed. And without pressure, effort loses urgency. So this is where the stress and all the anxiety and the boredom, they all start to coexist at once. Boredom because nothing is really demanding from you, right? Anxiety because you feel like you should be doing something that's more meaningful. And you feel stressed because time keeps passing when there is unclear direction in front of you. And that combination of all three confuses people. They think that freedom should feel peaceful, but peace without direction turns into drift. This is also why so many people, honestly, secretly prefer being told what to do. It's not because they lack ambition, but because instruction removes ambiguity. See, when someone tells you what's expected, your mind can relax. Okay, the decision is already made, the structure is already set. All you really have to do is execute upon that. And that doesn't mean people want control, it means that they want clarity. And so clarity that you so desire comes from structure. It usually does. This is where the paradox shows up, okay? People want freedom from authority, but they underestimate how much internal authority that freedom requires. Right? And once no one is assigning you tasks, you have to become the one assigning meaning and tasks to yourself. Once no one is enforcing standards, you have to enforce them yourself. Right? Once no one is watching, you have to decide whether what you're doing matters enough anyway to do it. That's super heavy. And it explains why freedom destabilizes people who aren't prepared to carry it. It's not that they can't handle the freedom. It's that freedom exposes the absence of internal systems and internal structure. Which brings us to the one realization that I want to push through on this episode is that freedom, it doesn't fail people. Unstructured freedom does. Okay, freedom without structure and the architecture to hold it up, it collapses inwards. And so that's why discipline isn't the opposite of freedom. It's what makes freedom usable. So you might be thinking, okay, well, how do I build the discipline to make freedom usable? Okay, that's what we need to essentially talk about next. And so the biggest misunderstanding about discipline is that people think that it limits freedom because they have a different idea of freedom. But in reality, discipline is what makes freedom possible without collapsing. Okay? Discipline isn't about forcing yourself to work harder, right? It's about moving the need to decide constantly. And so when discipline is working, there's something very specific that happens within your day that you can recognize. Your day stops being negotiable. Okay? The tasks, they don't compete for attention on which one you should do first. Time isn't up for debate for yourself. And energy isn't wasted on arguing internally with yourself. So it gives your willpower somewhere else to go. And that's the part that people miss, is that willpower, your own willpower, is limited. And so if you spend your willpower deciding when to work, if you work, or what to work on, there's not going to be any willpower left for doing the actual work. You want to know what fixes that? Structure. Because when your schedule is strict, your brain can relax. Not because it's easy or anything like that, but because it's super clear. Okay, personally, I can tell you, for me, loose structure does not work for me at all. I need things super set in stone. I need clear blocks. I need clear expectations. I need super clear timings. I need super clear outlines. I need everything to be set in stone, because when I veer off structure, the day starts feeling super compromised. Not ruined, okay, but compromised. And so once that happens, the mind starts negotiating. My mind starts negotiating. You know, I already messed this part up. I'll catch up later. I'll reset tomorrow. And so that's not a motivation issue. That's a boundary issue. Okay, the one thing that you need to know is that discipline works when it removes ambiguity. And when there's no ambiguity, there's no internal debate, right? When there's no debate, there's no friction. And when there's no friction, the execution for your tasks becomes automatic. And so that's why unstructured days feel heavier than structured ones. On an unstructured day, there's nothing that isn't allowed. Everything is technically allowed, right? You can scroll, you can rest, you can work, you can start tomorrow. And the openness to do all of that sounds freeing, but it's super deceptive in that manner. Because without boundaries, leniency creeps in. And not all at once, it does it gradually, so you don't really notice it day by day, right? The 10 minutes that you have becomes 30, okay? One skip task becomes a pattern, and one soft day can turn into a whole month of doing that. And nothing really dramatic happens. That's why it's so dangerous. Being in stagnation feels like comfort. It rarely feels like failure. And so to prevent that, discipline comes in and narrows your options. It channels your freedom. It doesn't remove it. Because freedom without structure, it leaks, and with it, it can compound. And so that's where discipline stops being about control and it starts being about self-respect, right? When you follow your own structure, you're proving something quietly to yourself, right? That you can trust yourself, that you do what you said you'd do, that your word matters to yourself, and that trust will accumulate. And once that accumulates, that'll build that self-trust within yourself, and freedom will stop feeling heavy, because now, once that self-trust exists in yourself, freedom isn't asking, what should I do with my life, right? What do I need to fill this time with? It's asking yourself, how do I execute what I've already decided matters? And that's a much lighter and easier question. Okay? Discipline's about consistency enforced by boundaries, right? The strict structure that everybody hates doesn't make you rigid, it makes you reliable. And that reliability actually is what turns freedom from anxiety into momentum. Okay, so you might be thinking, this is a lot of information. Like, how do I even use freedom, right? So I'm going to go into that next. How to design freedom so that it doesn't collapse on you. Okay, and so at this point in the episode, the pattern should be obvious. Okay, it should be clearly obvious, and I'll lay it out for you right now. Freedom doesn't fail because people misuse it recklessly. It fails because they leave it undefined. Right? When nothing has edges, everything can bleed together. Work bleeds into rest, and rest bleeds into avoidance. Time bleeds into distraction. And eventually, the momentum that you have, it disappears without anyone noticing. And so that's why the solution to the weight of freedom isn't motivation to get you into a state of doing. It's boundaries. It's structural ones. Boundaries are what give freedom shape, right? Without them, freedom becomes abstract. And once you have boundaries, that freedom that you have becomes usable. So this is the test that I want you to run, okay? It's a practical test. Okay, this is the test I want you to run, okay? Not philosophically, but really practically. Ask yourself one question. Where in my life am I technically free, but functionally drifting? Okay, that is usually the place with the least structure. Now, don't try to overhaul everything, right? That's how people fail this. Okay, instead, install one single non-negotiable boundary. Okay, something small, something super clear and enforced. Okay, examples for this that I've used in the past is like a specific time that is fixed. That is a start time for work. Okay, no debate. It starts then. Another one would be a hard cutoff for distractions, right? You turn off your TV at this point. You stop using your phone at this time, whatever the case may be, right? Maybe a daily block in your schedule that exists regardless of how you feel for a specific task, right? The point of all of this isn't discipline for, the sake of it. itself, but the point is to reduce decision load. Right? Every boundary that you set, it removes a question that your brain no longer has to answer. And when enough questions disappear, clarity shows up, right? This is how freedom becomes lighter. This is how your brain has enough bandwidth and willpower, right, to be able to do the tasks that matter. Not because responsibility goes away, but because responsibility becomes organized, okay? And there's a specific part that people resist, and you might feel it too. Boundaries that you set will feel restrictive at first. Okay, but that restriction is what gives direction, right? Think about it. Let me give you an example, right? A river, okay? Think about a river. Without banks on the side of it, it goes everywhere. It becomes like a flood, right? But a river with banks channels that water, and it becomes powerful. Okay, the same is true for your time. Right? Freedom without boundaries spreads thin. Freedom with boundaries gains force. And once you experience that shift, even once, you'll stop envying and romanticizing almost unstructured days. You'll stop craving the time where you just want to do whatever you want and doom scroll and watch Netflix and do whatever. And you'll start craving days that actually move somewhere. And so that's when you'll develop that maturity. Okay, the final realization of this episode is super simple, okay? Freedom doesn't ask you, what do you feel like doing today? What do you want to do today, okay? Freedom asks, what are you willing to be responsible for? And so, if you don't answer that question intentionally, life will answer it for you, usually through things such as anxiety or pressure or stagnation or boredom, right? So don't wait for structure to appear. Design it yourself, right? Don't wait to feel ready. Decide what actually matters to you and protect it with your boundaries. Because freedom, it's not the absence of limits. It's choosing the right ones for yourself. And when you do that, freedom stops feeling heavy, and it starts feeling purposeful to yourself. So thanks for listening to the Self-Discovery Files. This was episode 10. And next week is going to be the last episode of this year. So that'll be a big episode. I might make that one a bit longer for you guys. And stay tuned because that one will have a ton of gold in there. If you haven't followed the show already, follow me. Whatever platform you're on, you get notifications on when an episode goes live. I upload episodes every single Monday at 12 Eastern Standard Time. And yeah, you'll want to definitely follow because we're going to be, especially starting in the new year, we're going to be doing a ton of content. And so yeah, follow the podcast. If you haven't followed me on my socials, it's at the Dylan Phipps on TikTok and Instagram. We'll be building those this coming year as well. And yeah, you can also DM me there with any questions or anything that you have. And yeah, so thank you for listening. We will see you next Monday to close out 2025. Thanks for listening to the Self-Discovery Files. My name is Dylan Phipps. Keep showing up for yourself, stay grounded, stay curious, and keep becoming who you're meant to be.